thank you guys all for being here tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce, starting down at the end there, we have Dr. Timothy Burns, an oncologist at Ohio State's James Cancer Hospital. Jessica Carnes, a licensed radon professional with A to Z Solutions, and as I mentioned before, Jessica helped us conduct our on-the-ground testing for this series. And then Buddy Bush. Buddy is a Newark resident who we are very grateful he shared his family's story. Buddy lost his wife, Patty Bush, to lung cancer a couple of years ago. And Patty was a non-smoker, and believe it was linked to radon. So I've got a series of questions here tonight that we'll start off with, and then if you're in the audience, you will see there's a note card and a pen on your seat. Some people will be coming around to collect those. We're going to take questions toward the end from you guys, so feel free to jot a couple down, and we'll try to get them answered before we're done. So, Dr. Burns, we kind of touched on this in the last panel, but I was hoping you could explain a little bit more from the medical perspective. Why exactly is radon dangerous, and why do we think it causes lung cancer?
Yeah, so it's not the radon itself, although radon is something that's in the clay, in central Ohio, throughout the country. I mean, I was, previously in Baltimore area, had higher levels of radon, Pennsylvania also. But what it happens is when you breathe it in, it breaks down into plutonium. We all think of plutonium for nuclear bombs, and so that's essentially what's irradiating your lung. And what makes it so dangerous is it is a gas, and you can breathe it in, and then essentially you're exposing your lungs to radiation. And so really, I mean, we all know what plutonium is, and that's something we want to try to avoid, but that's really what radon becomes in your lungs.
This one perhaps for you again, Dr. Burns or Jessica. Why is there so much radon in Ohio? Why does it seem like so many tests come back with high levels here?
I mean, if you look at maps in general, if you just look at the United States, most of the northern states, there's almost a band across kind of the northern states will have high radon. You can have high radon in the south, but it really has to do with what's in the clay, and it's heterogeneous, meaning you can even be in the same neighborhood and one house have a high level and the next house not. My nurse practitioner was telling me a story. She was in an apartment building, and they tested her building and found only one side needed to be mitigated. And so actually she ended up with a pipe in her closet. But so it's really just, it's in the soil. It doesn't, it's just scattered. It's been there for millions of years in some cases, and when we disrupt the soil, this is what happens. I mean, we've actually known about radon causing cancer since the 1700s. Like the Austrians described it in their miners. So this is nothing. This isn't new.
Jessica, anything you wanted to add here?
Just to kind of build on what he said, it literally comes from our last ice age. As the glaciers receded, they left a number of deposits in our soil. And one of the things that they left was uranium. And uranium, as it breaks down, it goes through what's called a decay cycle. And it turns into different elements. It turns into things like polonium and lead. But it eventually turns into radon, and it goes from a solid form to a gas form. And at that point, it can travel. So instead of being trapped in the soil, it now has the ability to come back up to the surface, and that's what makes it dangerous. So he's right, it comes from that, but it's been in our soil forever, and as you notice, like he said, northern hemisphere, that's where your glaciers kind of receded and left those deposits.
And Jessica, when we were doing some reporting on this, I had a good conversation with you one time where you the EPA, they recommend you mitigate a building when it's at 4 picocuries per liter or above. Now, I feel like to a lot of people that's a sciencey term that is over their head because it was over mine at first. Yeah. So can you explain a little bit, what does that mean?
Sure. So radon's measured in something called picocuries per liter. As the doctor said, radon is a radioactive gas. So it gives off radiation particles. And what that means is that measurement is literally, if you can kind of imagine in your head, a liter of air. It's that many radioactive particles per liter of air is kind of the easiest way to describe it. So you think about, the volume of a liter of air. That's not a liter, but, you know, and then you say, okay, for that liter, you can have 4 radioactive particles per liter of air. If you have more than that, then you're above what they consider the action level. It's the easiest way to explain it.
To me, I was imagining like a 1 liter pop bottle.
Yeah, I
almost,
don't
you know
have
what
one,
I
or else
mean?
I would have, you know, used it. But yeah, that's what you're looking at.
Makes sense. Buddy, tell me a little bit about, take us back a little bit to when Patty was diagnosed with lung cancer. Tell us how you guys discovered it, and how you ended up kind of connecting the dots to it maybe being radon.
Well, Patty had had a nagging cough for probably a few months. And it was spring, we just, checked it off to allergies or something like that. And she was not someone who wanted to go to the doctor. She just had, for some reason, a mistrust of the medical field. Apologies. But that's who she was.
Right.
And so she didn't want to go until we were babysitting our grandson. She reached over the pack and play, you got to bend down really low. And as she picked him up, she turned her head to cough. And when she coughed, she felt a pop in her rib. And again, I had to talk her into going to urgent care the next day because I could see it was really painful. And so we got to urgent care. They did the x-ray and the doctor came back and they said, well, yeah, you do have a broken rib, but you've got a bigger problem. And that's when he said, you have the size of an orange, cancer the size of an orange in your lung. And he had called the emergency room at the hospital in Licking County in Newark, and so we headed over there, and it was just kind of like surreal.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
What, when did a doctor suggest that it might be radon, or how did you kind of find out about that as a possibility?
I can't tell you I really remember that. I know that they did talk about it, I think at the Licking hospital, but then I think a little bit more at the James when we decided to go there.
Sure.
And then we had, it's some of those things you think back on. The house that we lived in was in a nice neighborhood. Behind us was a neighbor who had medical problems. Somebody said, they said it was cancer. It might be something in the ground, but your mind just doesn't. If you don't know what it is, your mind doesn't click to say, oh, well, that could be me.
Right.
And so, for a couple of years we just ignored it. And so. Yeah, so we'd heard about radon, but it's one of those things you kind of think, but that's not going to happen to me.
Right. For sure.
Yeah.
So many of those things.
Yeah.
And then I know Patty wasn't a smoker. Something we heard from a lot of people we had interviewed was they were so shocked to get this diagnosis because they had never smoked. Was it a pretty big shock for you guys?
It was, and I will just say that you do live with the stigma of being a smoker.
Sure.
That people automatically assume that it's your fault, you must have been doing something wrong, Patty grew up in Seattle, there's enough rain there, it washes anything out of the atmosphere that would be poisonous. She never smoked, she was exercised, they're very committed to exercising, so it just caught us completely off guard. She would be the last person you would expect to have cancer, lung cancer, yeah.
Dr. Burns, to Buddy's point, I've heard again and again and again that lung cancer is definitely one of the cancers that has a pretty big stigma around it. Can you talk about that and why that is?
Yeah. So unfortunately, unfortunately, lung cancer never had its Ryan White, never had its Magic Johnson, and so there's always been this stigma with lung cancer. Personally, I lost both my parents. They're both smokers. They're both pretty young. They may have had smoking-related lung cancer, may not. But the point is, we have other diseases like heart disease, diabetes, many things that we do to our bodies, and there's less stigma with that. And so that has been part of the issue. The other part is until recently, we have not had as many survivors. That's changing. And so as we're having more survivors, there's more walks and there's more people out there. The stats are the stats. Lung cancer is the most common killer of both men and women. Kills 1.5 times more women than breast cancer. Kills twice as many men as prostate cancer. Everyone knows someone with lung cancer, but they generally don't speak about their diagnosis. There's still the stigma of it. Interestingly, if you look at smokers, there are never smoking lung cancers in smokers, and you can tell based on some of the testing we do. They don't have a lot of mutations. we can't say it's radon or what it is, but it doesn't look like a carcinogen-induced, which is, different from radon. Doesn't look like a carcinogen-induced cancer, but it's a huge issue that we have, and it's hurt the field from funding from the government and kind of, just our appreciation of this. But, everyone probably knows someone who's had lung cancer.
I think part of that story is also that the thing people think is, well, you must have done something
Right.
in your past.
Right.
Maybe you're not a smoker now, but you must have done something. We didn't know you back then, so you
Right.
must have been smoking back
Right.
then, and now you're paying the price for it. And that's another part of that stigma issue.
Doctor, you kind of just alluded to this, but is there really a way to tell whether somebody's cancer was directly linked to radon, or are there sort of signs that it might be an outside factor?
So not directly related to radon. I mean, there's tests that we do kind of standardly when we're looking for mutations in people's tumors, and we also look to just say, how many mutations do you have in your tumor? And patients that have a carcinogen-induced, which is mostly smoking, I mean, there's other exposures, but they're less common that can cause it, like diesel fuel and other things, where you can say, okay, this was caused by, a carcinogen. So we often will see most of the time in never smokers will have kind of a very low kind of mutation burden. And then we also have some smokers that have that too. So you can actually be a smoker and not actually have a smoking related lung cancer. But we can't say that it's radon induced, and it is more commonly associated with some of the mutations we find, but there's no smoking gun at this point.
Jessica, can you talk a little bit about, I'm curious, are older homes more prone to radon, newer homes, and can you explain sort of why one might be and the other might not be, or vice versa?
Sure. So that's kind of a myth that a lot of people, we've heard kind of both sides of it. They'll say, well, my house is over 100 years old, it can't have radon, or my house is less than a year old and it can't have radon. And to tell you the truth, it really doesn't matter. The only thing that it matters is where your house was built, the ground it was built on. So, older homes, they tend to be, have more cracks in the concrete in the basement, and they've got, older walls in the basement, so you have more areas and pathways for radon to enter versus a newer home. But newer homes are built tighter, so they have less of an air exchange, so you have more opportunity for the radon to not have any kind of delineation, any kind of venting. So both can be a problem, just in different ways. But at the end of the day, it really only matters where the house was built. And was it built on top of land that contains that decayed uranium that's going to turn into radon?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Does that land have to be disturbed for the gases to release, or does it just come up everywhere, but because it's open air, it doesn't impact people as much?
So outdoor radon concentrations vary between like 1.6 and 2.1. And that's primarily because of you have ventilation. Now, if you're going, you trap it by building a house on top of it or a building on top of it, and now when it comes into the air, it's now in your breathable airspace, and there's not that ventilation that you normally would have.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Jessica, obviously, me and Sammy Madar, our photographer, is here today. We followed you around for a morning
Oh, yes.
to test some homes. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, we went to older homes, newer homes. There was a woman who actually bought her home, her childhood home, from her parents. A person who had tested their home previously, and it was below the threshold, but then our test, it came back higher because they
Right.
had updated some things. So can you talk a little bit about those?
Sure. So your risk factor for developing health effects of radon depend on two things. They depend on the length of exposure and the amount of exposure. Now, smoking obviously increases that risk tremendously, but as a never smoker, those are the two things that you look for. So when we go to houses, and the woman there told me, I've lived in this house for 30 years. Right away, I'm going, oh Lord, please don't let this be high, because that, level of long term of exposure is obviously much higher than someone who just moved into the house. So that being the case, we wanted to make sure that those levels were below, and I mean, if not, then obviously you want to get it fixed. That's why it's most important to take care of radon, like when you move into a home. Like, get it done with a real estate transaction. Don't live in a house. And that being said, if you are living in a house right now, find out what your level is and get it fixed as soon as possible, because you never know. So you definitely want to address it. Well, I'm sorry, what was the other part of that question?
I was just asking you to kind of tell a little bit about some of the things that we saw.
Oh, okay. So we also had a house that had stone walls in the basement. And he told us that he had had it tested and it was fine, and then he changed out his HVAC. And I said, okay. So again, when you're changing things like the structure of the house, or you're changing the HVAC system in the house, those things control the airflow and the air exchange inside the house. So you always want to retest, and you always want to make sure that your levels are still the same, because they can change. Well, it turns out not only was his level in the basement now high, but I tested on the first floor as well to see what that delineation factor was going to be, and his level on the first floor was a 6. So, like, even not being in the basement, because it was an older home, he's like, we don't use the basement. But even just existing on the first floor, he was still above the EPA action level. So it's really important to make sure that you get those tested, and then if you do any kind of changes like that to your home, you get it retested. And the EPA actually recommends that if you have a system, that you test it every 2 years, just to make sure it's still doing what it's supposed to be doing. And it's always good to, have that information and keep that test, because even the gauges that are on the mitigation systems, they don't measure radon. A lot of people think they measure radon. So if it says 2 on the, it's called a YouTube thermometer, they're like, well, my level's 2. No, your level's not 2. What that measures is something called inches of water column. So it only tells you really if your fan motor's working or not. So you want to make sure that you're retesting every 2 years to make sure your levels are below 4.
And Jessica, can you tell our friends here a little bit about how do you test for radon? What does the test consist of? And then there's also these things called continuous monitors that we're going to let people borrow.
Yeah, I'm so excited to hear about that. That's awesome. So continuous radon monitors, what they have available here, those are, they take about 6 to 10 air samples an hour, and you leave them for a period of 48 hours. And then you can print them out, and they give you not only an averaged hourly reading, but they also give you your overall 48-hour average. Those are what's primarily used in residential testing as the go-to, because you can get results pretty fast. And they're calibrated. They have to be calibrated once a year. They're cross-checked twice a year, so they are relatively accurate. The only thing that could make them not accurate is the human interference of how you're setting them up. So I'm assuming that there's a bunch of instructions that come with the continuous radon monitors. I suggest you follow them carefully. And if you have any questions or any doubts, there are radon professionals all over Columbus that you could hire to come in and do your test for you to make sure that it's 100% accurate. Above and beyond that, you have what are called passive devices, which is what we used when we were testing all 70 of those houses. And those are activated charcoal. And those are set for, again, a period of 48 hours. They're picked up, they're sent to a lab. The lab then does the analysis of them and sends us a report for them.
Luckily, the monitors that we've got for people to borrow, they're literally plug and play,
Plug
so
and
they're
play.
easy to turn on and stuff. Just
Yeah.
got to put them on the lowest level of your home. So, some overall questions for each of you. We've talked a lot about tonight about how a lot of people, even though radon has been known for centuries, really, been kind of heightened to a household issue in the 80s. Why do each of you think that there is this, what seems to be a real lack of awareness around this?
I think one thing that we discovered, or felt like we discovered, it just seemed like Patty and her friend Annie, who was in that article as well, were really advocating for a test to be done at any real estate transaction, that it would just be part of the process. And I know real estate agents have piles of regulatory forms they got to do, but this one I think would be probably the most important one for the safety of this. So to me, I don't want to blame anybody, but I think the real estate lobbyists have a lot of power, and they kind of help prevent, because the real estate agencies don't want to have one more test or have something that could possibly delay. I don't want to, I don't want to talk badly of them, but don't want to have something that'll delay a sale. The sad thing about it, as you know, it's so easily mitigated with fairly low cost. It could be something easily dealt with in the transaction itself. So I think that's part of what it is.
I agree. I do agree. So radon is managed differently than a lot of other environmental contamination throughout the United States. So I do testing all over the country, and radon is managed by state. It isn't managed by federal anything. So whereas the rules and regulations that exist in Ohio are not the same as that exist in Michigan, not the same that exist in Kentucky, so on and so forth. The radon program overall is funded by something called a surge grant, and it is vastly underfunded. So even the states that have regulatory programs have very, very, very small budgets that they work with. Ohio is actually one of the more well-regulated states for radon. And that is, taken as a whole. There are some that have zero regulations. So I think that really, plays into it as well. You're right. There are people who have lobbying interests who say, we don't want this. We don't want it to screw up our deal. We don't want to deal with it in our school. We don't want to deal with it. There's a lot of people with different interests, and you run up against that. So, I sit on the board of the Ohio Association of Radon Professionals, which is the trade organization for Ohio, and we lobby for more testing, more public awareness, more advocacy, so on and so forth. And I mean, big, huge thank you to the dispatch, because they have done wonders to help us in that effort. In fact, we have had more meetings in the last 2 weeks than I have time to go through. But, we're making efforts and we're making strides, and the more public awareness we have about it, the easier it is to open those doors and make those regulations and get those legislators to listen. Because there are states that have legislation in place, and they did it, they got it. We're just kind of lagging behind, and politics is politics, and so we're trying very hard to get those rules on the books.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what everyone said. I think part of the issue is there's a lot of urban legends out there about, it's an older house or it's a newer house, or it's only if you lived in the basement and you had like I had some family members that did this, where you had one family in the basement, one on the first floor. It's only the basement you have to worry about. And then it's also kind of this, I think it's hard for people to get that this isn't like a Superfund site or some other environmental disaster, or you live next to a factory or whatever this is, or you lived in Pittsburgh in the 60s where you woke up with soot on your cars. It's really everywhere. And so in some ways it's a little more daunting, although, doable, right? Especially with a lot of these monitors where, that are continuous monitors and stuff, it could be done. And really what we're talking about is pipes. I mean, at the end of the day, it's, they're pipes with fans, right? This isn't like a high-tech fix. But I think that's part of people realizing that this is and can be everywhere.
Something we had heard too is because you can't see it, because you can't smell it, because the health effects might show up years later. It's kind of easy to put that off. Just as a reminder, we're going to have some people walking around the room in a few moments. Danae and Samantha and Rick Ruin in the back there collecting note cards. If you have a question, please write it on that and give it to them, and they'll feed them to me up here.
Can I say one more thing about
Sure.
that whole? The other thing that I think we kind of walked through was that radon is just such a mysterious thing. It seems like when we did our test, we had no idea what pico things were or anything, but ours measured at 24 in the house, which is pretty high.
Yeah.
And of course, my initial thought is, why did Patty have a problem? And I thought, do I also have a problem? Because all of a sudden I'm thinking my kids are going to lose both parents. So I went and got tested, and there was nothing that showed in my lung. And so my mom was a smoker, so I breathed a lot of secondhand smokes in the 50s. You always had your car windows rolled up and smoke was, in the car with you. And I didn't get it. So I think there's just still kind of a mystery about it that people, again, think it's not going to happen to me.
Yeah. I just want to make one point, because we keep throwing this number of 4 out there. So what does that mean in terms of your risk, right? So if you're a never smoker, your risk of getting lung cancer is during your lifetime is like 0.7, it's almost 1%, so 1 in 100. If you're a smoker, and I bet the same is going to be true for people that vape, it's 10 times that. So, when we're saying 4, that means 6 out of, so not everybody, but, 1 out of 100, or if you're a smoker or you're vaping, probably 6 out of 100, and that's at 4. And then, the risk goes up the farther we go. So, I mean, these are substantial percentages. So when we say it's 4, what does that mean? I mean, that's there's a real risk of you getting this disease.
I think we had written, Buddy, in the article that the level of radon in your and Patty's household was like getting, I think it had been compared to around 1,000 chest x-rays a year or
Yeah.
more, which is pretty significant. Most
Yeah.
people don't
Yeah.
even have one, let alone 1,000.
Yeah.
So, I did want to ask, because we've brought it up a couple times while we've been talking, this idea of requiring radon testing during real estate transactions. We did find one other municipality, at least in the U.S., there might be some others that require it. Is that something that you guys think should be a thing here in Ohio?
I agree. I think it should. And we fought really, really hard to get it. And in the end, we were up against, the Senate and the House of Representatives itself, and then we had other interested parties, such as the real estate lobby, that were saying, "Wait, that's just a bridge too far."
Sure.
And so the last piece that we were able to get was literally like a disclosure that said, "Hey, this could be a problem. Please get some information, please," because most people, when they sell their house, they literally depend on the realtor to tell them, you should do this or you shouldn't do this or whatever, and and that's not necessarily the best person to get the advice from as to something that is so important to your health. So you want to make sure you're doing your own research and making your own decision and making sure it's an informed decision.
Are schools or public facilities required to do that at this point in
No.
time?
No.
They
You
are
think
not.
about all these kids who are in grade schools or junior highs, and they're in there 8 hours a day or more, and they're breathing all of that, and it's just kind of, why would they not at least require some? That would probably be an expensive system.
Well,
but-
in the last round of the budget that just went back around last year, we had in the budget we had $50 million for radon testing and mitigation in schools. It was in the budget. It was a line item in the budget. They took it out at the last minute because they didn't want to spend any new money. We went back. We tried to back the number down and said, okay, let's do a tiered system. Let's do this. Let's do that. And they did not want to put anything in the budget that wasn't already funded. And so they didn't feel it was priority enough to put it in. So we've had things like that before. It seems to always get kind of thwarted by one party or another, and so that's what you face when you go through these. I mean, we're currently working on legislation right now, and I'm very, very hopeful with all the exposure that we've gotten that it's going to go through this time, but you never know.
Yeah, but I mean, lead paint and asbestos, that's required to be tested in
Correct.
public
Yeah.
buildings
Yes, it
and
is.
schools. And to be honest, to remove asbestos is much more expensive, or lead paint, it's much more expensive than
Yeah.
putting a couple of really pipes in. That's really,
Yeah.
I mean, even if it's a large building.
We found in our reporting too that there are a few cities, Pickerington, Dublin, and Powell, to name a couple, that do require passive mitigation systems in all new construction. Why do you guys think we haven't seen that in more locations? Same thing as testing.
So passive mitigation systems in new construction is kind of a tricky thing, because as of right now, in order to change that, you have to change the building code, and we've lobbied to change the building code, but they don't necessarily the Builders Association is not amenable to that. So right now there are builders that offer passive radon systems. However, you have to be very careful that the passive radon system they're offering is actually being installed by a licensed radon mitigation company and not the plumber. Because we've come across so many people who falsely believe that they have this mitigation system and it's going to take care of everything, and it doesn't even have the word radon spelled right on it. I mean, it's terrible, and every time I see it, I cringe, and I'm like, God, please let somebody who knew what they were doing put this in. And then we're like, oh, no, this is bad. So in the state of Ohio, you do not have to be a licensed radon person to put in a passive system. However, you have to be a licensed radon person to activate that system and put a fan motor on it. So, you know, it's kind of a little tricky, but what we'd like to see is passive systems being required and being required by a licensed radon,
Sure.
you know, person to do it, because we want to make sure that if they're going to do it, that it's going to work.
Something else that we had found was that Newark's 43055 zip code in particular, Harvard study that came out earlier this year, said that it has the highest concentration of radon in the country. We'd heard a few times too that the overwhelming majority of tests that take place in Licking County come back with really high results. And I'm curious, is that something that you've all heard about at this point too?
Yes, Franklin and Licking County have some of the highest radon in the state. Always have. Now, the data, the historical data for radon is tracked through the University of Toledo. They do an okay job of it, but you know, we also have labs that process this data, and we can look at those labs, that lab data, and it's a lot of times a lot more substantial and a lot more accurate. And yes, it absolutely says that when it does the average, you know, the average result versus, you know, the amount that they've done. Newark and Licking County, I mean, Licking County and Franklin County have a serious problem with it.
Since I've become aware of the problem, you know, I automatically look for those pipes outside the house or coming up, and it's amazing how few houses
Right.
have those, you know, so you realize that either there's a lack of awareness or a lack of understanding of the seriousness of it. Yeah.
Money.
Yeah, but, yeah.
It's always just the Constitution or not. You've either read the Constitution, the law of America's land, we the people of the United States of America in order to form a more perfect union of land, or you yet read the Constitution of the United States of America.
Hear, hear.
If you read the Constitution of the United States of America, eyes on the letters of the law, you see the truth at America.
Yep.
If you yet read the Constitution, you yet see the truth at America.
Appreciate that. One more question before we get to audience questions, because I didn't touch on it. Is there anything, if let's say you're not a homeowner, you rent, can you test your property, and you know, what should you do if that test comes back high?
Well, I mean, there's nobody that can stop you from going to get a CRM or going to get a kit and testing your place that you live. The problem comes in is to, okay, now I have this, now what do I do? There are rules that govern multifamily testing, and those rules have to do with mostly with lender and financial transactions. So, for example, if the owner of a building is using HUD money, they are required to test for radon anytime they want to use HUD money. They're required to mitigate for radon anytime they want to use HUD money, whether it be for a transaction or a remodel or any of that. They're required to do it. Fannie Freddie also has requirements on, you know, using that kind of money. So those kind of things are in place primarily because as a renter, you cannot go fix your space if you do have, you know, elevated levels. Outside of that HUD, outside of Fannie Freddie, there is no law that says that they have to do it. So even if you have a result that says, hey, I have high levels of radon, and you take it to your property manager, they're not obligated to do it. Now, you know, legally, they're not obligated to do anything about it. So, you know, unfortunately, those are the only laws that kind of govern that.
Okay. Going to switch to audience questions here. I did want to mention, by the way, that we did invite the Ohio Department of Health to sit on this panel tonight. They declined, but they did send some flyers that are in the back of the room, so feel free to pick one up on your way out if you'd like to. The Ohio Department of Health does, as we mentioned earlier, they do offer free test kits, so if you're not able to get one of the continuous monitors tonight, you can go online and order a test kit from them. Also, as previously mentioned, those monitors after this event, once they come back, there will be one available at each of the library's 23 branches for card members to borrow. So this first question from the audience is any level of radon safe? Which I feel like is a good question because we've been talking about this 4 number.
So I probably not, but I mean, I think, it gets to, I mean, even a lot of studies have shown, a significant increased risk and even, levels of 1.5. And so, and it also depends, are you a smoker, are you not, or do you vape, do you not? I mean, I think really trying to get the levels down to, the outside. I mean, that's, there's radon here, but right now, but it's such a low level that it's not, the chance of it doing damage is much lower. But I really think that, if you identify, a level even between, people say 1.5 and 4, and even 4, you definitely should be doing something about. But I think it's, trying to get it as low as possible, I think is probably best long term.
I think the most important thing is to understand where that comes from, where that 4 comes from.
Yeah.
So the EPA set it at 4.0 picocuries per liter because of something called ALARA, which means as low as reasonably achievable. And you have to understand that when they're setting that, they're setting it for the entire country. Well, the country has very different geology, very different terrain, very different weather conditions. So what you can achieve here, you may not be able to achieve there. And so the EPA had to kind of draw a line in the sand and say, 4, that's the number. That's not the same number as Canada. Canada's number's 10. And it's because Canada has they got frozen ground in half of it, and it's really, really difficult. The World Health Organization's number is 2.6. So it's, it's very different depending on where you're looking at it, but that's why it was set at 4. It's because it's reasonably achievable that you should be able to mitigate a home below 4 picocuries per liter.
Another question related to health. How can someone get a lung cancer screening if they don't technically qualify for one? Is there a way to do that? If you know that you've been living in an environment with a lot of radon, is there a way to try to get one?
So the NCCN, which is called the National Cancer Center Comprehensive Network, they put out a lot of guidelines that Medicare follows. And one of the guidelines they've put out is if you've had a significant radon exposure, they actually recommend CT screening. And so so that's one way that it can be done on a case-by-case basis. I will say that James now has kind of a mobile CT screener. We're trying to take that around different sites, and we're trying to look at ways to expand beyond the current population, which is anyone from the ages of 55 to 80 with a 30-pack year history, meaning you smoked a pack a day for 30 years and you quit within the last 15 years. And we're trying to work with Ohio Health and other organizations to find ways of expanding that. And there's more and more data coming out that it would probably be cost effective and reasonable to screen that population regardless of smoking history, but we're not there yet. But there is some ways of doing it based on what the NCCN is recommending, but it's not easy to do.
When my wife was diagnosed, we tested the house, found out how high it was, and I called my doctor and I said, listen, I want to get tested because I wanted to know if I had it as well for the kids' sake and stuff. And so if you do a test and you find out it's relatively high, I think often you can call your primary care physician and say, this is what's going on, would you mind recommending a scan for me or something?
And it's also something we need to educate the primary care docs, because there's still a lot of primary care doctors that aren't even recommending lung cancer screening. And so this is a step beyond that, but it is, you can get it covered. It's in the NCCN guidelines are generally covered by Medicare.
Jessica, can you explain a little bit more about how a mitigation system works and how much roughly does one cost? I know it's going to probably vary depending on where you live, but
so mitigation systems, they're called sub-slab depressurization systems. And what they do is they control the airflow under the slab. They create what's called a negative pressure field, which controls the airflow under the slab and kind of directs the air into the piping and exhausts out the roof line, keeping it out of the breathable airspace. The radon particles are actually lighter than oxygen particles, and so they're a lot easier to control. And so by using a fan motor and the series of pipes, you can depressurize the entire foundation of a building and control the airflow into the slab and not allow that to come up through the basement, concrete and into your breathable airspace.
And in our case, that's exactly what they did. It's just almost like a big vacuum cleaner for under the ground. And they had to seal the, in layman's terms.
Yeah.
And they had to seal the sump pump because those gases, if you don't do that, those gases can still come up through the sump pump area. So
Yep.
that's the other thing to expect in something like that.
They do seal the sump pump. They also seal cracks in the
Yeah.
floor. They'll caulk those up. Any kind of perimeter drains, things of that nature they address. They're basically trying to make sure that all the air that's under your slab normally is getting moved into that pipe system and exhausted above your roof line.
And systems typically run what around?
Okay. So your basic system. Now, keep in mind, like, everybody's house is different. Some people have one basement. Some people live in split levels. Some people have dirt crawl spaces that need to be treated. Some people don't. But in this area, you're looking somewhere between, I'd say, what, 1,500, 2,500? Is that reasonable, Shad? Yeah. Shad sitting, he actually owns a mitigation company right here in Columbus area. So yes, about $1,500, $2,500. $2,500 being if you have a dirt crawl space and you got to treat it, and you may have multiple slabs and things of that nature. But again, everybody's house is different.
This person asks, my house is on a slab. Do I need to test? And then also, does the season create a variance there with what you might get back in terms of results?
The only people that don't have to test for radon are people that live in tree houses. Everybody else, if you got ground contact with your house, you have the opportunity for radon to come up in. So is there a seasonal variability? Yes. So in testing, the EPA actually recommends you do a long-term test, which is like a year-long test. However, no one wants to wait an entire year to sell their house and wait for their radon results to come back. So the 48-hour test, the snapshot test, was created to kind of give you an idea of what your overall radon picture looks like, which is why when you do a radon test, a short term, they tell you have to keep your windows shut, you got to keep your doors shut. They want you to mimic kind of what the conditions of our weather are most of the year, which, just like now, this is Ohio weather, we have doors and windows closed, and so you want to mimic that for the short-term test. So you can have variability in seasonality, which is why a long-term test is 91 days, and they recommend that you go from a heating to a cooling season or a cooling to a heating season so that you can kind of see what that looks like, for your overall exposure.
Can I ask a question? If say you're going to sell your house, and we've done this in the past, and we've always used the kind of tests you send away, and if you had a continuous monitor, like how do you document that? Like with with the one you send away, you get back a sheet that says, "This is what I have," on this day. But like say if I'm using a continuous monitor and it's 1, I'm like, great, or it's 0.5, like, but then I go to sell my house and someone's like, well, prove it. Like how do you? Like for those sorts of things, are there better tests to use for that?
So if you are going to test for radon during a real estate transaction, you're required to hire a radon professional to do the testing. You can't do your own test and say, here's my radon results. With a continuous radon monitor, there is a report that prints off of those machines. And those reports, most radon testers own those machines, and so their reports are very custom to them. And if you do a passive radon system, then a passive radon test, then you'll get a lab report, basically. Right. But either way, if you're going to do it during a real estate transaction, you have to actually hire someone to do it for you, a licensed radon tester.
One person asks, this is the first time I've ever heard the suggestion of retesting every 2 years. What do you do if you do retest and you have a mitigation system and it comes back high?
So, what's important to remember most about mitigation systems is they are designed to depressurize the area that exists at the time they were installed. And even if you walk into a house that you're going to buy and it's got a mitigation system already in it, I would still test it, because you have no idea what's happened to that house since the time that that mitigation system was installed. So you can never ever say, well, I did it, it's fine, you're done. There are things that happen that you may not even be aware of, such as, like you said, you had to get a new furnace, and that changes your entire airflow pattern, which then changes the ability for the pathway for the radon to come in. So you want to make sure that you're retesting it every 2 years, just to make sure that it's running and doing what it's supposed to be doing, and depressurizing your entire basement, not just part of it, or maybe there was a room or something that wasn't there whenever it was actually installed. So you just want, that's the only way to really know, is to test.
And just 2 more questions here. Dr. Burns, is there any strong connection between radon exposure and acute lymphoblastic leukemia? My understanding is, other than lung cancer, it's sort of still early days in knowing how much this contributes to other health issues.
Yeah, and it's a great question, and it's and it's also more complicated that patients that have ALL, they can have very young children, which it's probably not related, because it's not too quick a time for the exposure, and then you have adults that can get ALL, and so that's good. But I think it's still an open question, but I think it's definitely possible for adults ALL that could be possible. For children, it's probably not.
Okay. And then sort of my favorite question to ask at the end of an interview as a reporter, what are you hoping our guests here tonight take away from this conversation? Is there anything else you'd like to add that you think they should know that we didn't touch on?
So really 2 things is that this is, in terms of radon, this is something that is easy to test, relatively easy to test for, relatively easy to fix, and can have kind of profound health consequences. And then secondly, if you've been exposed to radon, you've lived in a house with high radon levels, if you're a smoker or you vape, to make sure that you take advantage of CT screening, because that really, unfortunately, a lot of patients are diagnosed late and their survival is not as good. This is especially a curable disease if it's caught early. So.
Well, first of all, I hope that every single one of you goes and tests your house, whether it be through the library, whether it be through hiring somebody, whether it be through the Ohio Department of Health. You need to know what your level is and know your exposure. Whether it's your home, whether it's a rental, whether it's an apartment, whatever it is, you need to know what your exposure is. And secondly, you need to, also think about the other places where you spend a lot of time. If you are, your job, if you have kids, if they go to school, daycares, those kind of things, having that, cutting down on their exposure is the only way to prevent this from being part of their story. And you want to make sure that it's so frustrating, because it's such a deadly cancer, but it's so preventable. Mm-hmm. And if we just took the steps and valued our health enough to take the steps to make sure that we're not having that exposure wherever we can minimize our risk, then we would have so many less cases that we would have to deal with at the James and other centers like that.
Yeah, and from my standpoint, I would echo what they're saying, is that each of you would be thinking about not just your own home, but your kids' homes and your grandkids' homes, because you don't want them to suffer with this. And I think sometimes of all the effort we put into dieting for health and exercise for health, and this is just such an easy thing to do for your long-term health. The other thing I would say is, at some point in time, hopefully, you would have the opportunity to support and advocate for some of the changes that just seem to be very simple, simple to me anyway, changes in the state that would require some of these things to be taken care of in the public buildings or in real estate transactions to protect people who don't know and aren't aware. So that's, yeah.
Agreed.
Well, thank you to each of our panelists for being here tonight. We really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us as well. On your way out the door, please grab a cookie and a water, and we've got copies of the Radon series over there as well. You can read it at dispatch.com/radon.
And I just want to say thank you to the Columbus Dispatch for their coverage on this article, their vision for it. Say thank you to Max and his team that reported on it, did such a great job on the article. And then I want to recognize James too, because my wife, we started at Licking Memorial Hospital, a really good hospital, but they did not have the resources. They recommended removal of a part of a lung. But the doctor said to us, but you can go some other place if you want to. Just kind of put that little hint in, and we chose the James, and it was a family of people. So.